I was sitting on the bench near the corner cafe, the sunlight catching the dust in the like tiny suspended stars, when I heard her. Her voice was quiet but firm, a fragile sort of insistence that made the words land like stones in my chest. "I need a home to call my own," she said, almost as if speaking to herself. I looked up from the book I had been pretending to read and saw her sitting on the opposite bench. She had her knees drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped around them, and her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the trees. Something in her posture told me she wasn't used to being seen, yet she was, maybe unwillingly, but still. And I said softly, without any rush, "What if it's a home we call ours?" Her eyes flicked toward me, startled, like she hadn't expected anyone to respond. She hesitated, and in that pause, I realized I wasn't offering her a home with walls and furniture, but something more, the possibility of company, of not having to face the world alone for a while. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she hugged her knees tighter and stared down at the cracks in the pavement. I sensed the weight she carried, past mistakes, small defeats, quiet moments of loneliness she hadn't shared with anyone. But there was also a thread of something else, a fragile curiosity, a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, someone might care without demanding everything in return. I closed my book and shifted slightly closer on the bench, careful not to intrude. My presence was steady, quiet, deliberate. I didn't know her name yet, didn't know why she was sitting there alone in the middle of the afternoon, but somehow, that didn't matter. Right now, all that mattered was being here, listening with my own silence. Finally, she looked up. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of surprise, caution, and something I recognized in myself, a willingness to try again despite the odds. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I understood it as an invitation, not a plea. We spent the next hour talking in fragments. Her voice was hesitant at first, brushing over details like someone testing whether it was safe to step forward. She mentioned a job she was trying to hold together, a small apartment that had slipped away, a quiet fear of being left behind. I offered nothing more than my attention, but even that seemed to matter. I made no promises, asked no intrusive questions. I simply existed beside her, steady and uncomplicated. At some point, she laughed, a small, uneven sound that seemed to surprise even her. I smiled without thinking, noticing how rare it was to witness such a genuine break in someone's defenses. There was no magic in it, no grand gestures, just the shared warmth of two people acknowledging each other's existence and finding comfort in it. As the sun began its slow descent behind the buildings, she shifted on the bench, brushing her hair behind. The afternoon had changed, subtly, quietly, as if it had always been waiting for this. A moment of unexpected companionship. I felt no rush, no pressure, only the steady pulse of awareness that maybe something important had begun here, in the gentle collision of solitude and openness. When she finally stood to leave, I didn't ask her to stay. I didn't need to. I simply offered a look that said, without words, "I'll be here if you want to return." She glanced back once, a fleeting smile, and walked down the street, leaving the soft echo of her presence lingering on the empty bench. I stayed seated for a long while, breathing in the quiet, knowing that the space between us had already shifted. Something subtle, something real, had begun, and I felt the patient certainty of my chest. The world didn't need to change. For now, it was enough that we had noticed each other, that a sentence, a simple exchange, had started something that neither of us fully understood yet. The next morning, I found myself walking the same streets, almost unconsciously, as if retracing the path where yesterday's words had led. The bench was empty, the air cooler than I expected, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt from an early drizzle. I wasn't looking, not exactly. I was looking for the chance to see if the fragile connection from yesterday could quietly endure. And then I saw her, sitting a few blocks down, her shoulders hunched, a coat wrapped tight against the morning chill. She wasn't expecting me. She barely looked up as I approached, my steps deliberate and unhurried. "Good morning," I said softly, careful not to break whatever fragile bubble she'd created around herself. She flinched, a tiny motion, like a bird startled by a shadow. Then she managed a nod, eyes returning immediately to the ground. "Morning," she murmured. Her voice had lost some of its firmness, replaced by a tired edge I couldn't ignore. I sat down a few feet away, leaving enough space to respect her solitude but close enough to be noticed. Silence passed between us for a moment, and then she spoke, words spilling almost against her own will. I don't have anywhere to go after work tonight. The place I was staying. I can't." Her voice faltered, and she trailed off. I didn't interrupt. I simply nodded, letting her know that I was present, that I could listen without judgment or intrusion. "You can stay here for a bit if you want," I said finally, my tone steady, almost casual. Not a command, not an obligation, just an offered hand without pressure. She blinked, startled, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse, shrink back into the habit of holding herself alone. But she didn't. She gave a small, tentative smile and exhaled, a breath that seemed to carry months of tension. I think I'd like that, she said. We walked together, silently, toward a quiet apartment building I had rented for simplicity, a place where I often spent evenings reading or sketching in solitude. I didn't expect her to unpack her life there. I didn't even expect her to speak much. I merely opened the door and waited, a simple gesture that seemed to matter more than I could have predicted. She lingered in the doorway, hesitant. I don't want to be a burden, she said softly, almost ashamed. You're not a burden, I replied. Not tonight. Not ever. She looked at me then, really looked, and I caught the flash of something that had been buried under layers of fear and practical worry. Relief. Relief. Tempered by disbelief. Relief. Tempered by habit. Relief. Fragile as glass, but unmistakable. We didn't talk much that night. I made tea while she unpacked a small bag, careful not to hover, careful not to crowd. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing the edges of the permission I'd quietly offered. The apartment smelled faintly of old wood and paper, simple and unassuming, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. Later, we sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, my own untouched. I watched her, aware that she was measuring the quiet, the safety, the possibility of simply existing without fear. She shifted in her seat, and for the first time I saw her shoulders relax, just a fraction, as if the act of staying, really staying, was an unfamiliar but welcome luxury. Night fell, and the streetlights outside cast long patterns on the floor. She didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. We existed in parallel, two people sharing a space without demand. And yet, in the stillness, in the unspoken consent of presence, something began to form, a fragile understanding that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, someone had chosen to simply be there. When I finally stood to check the lock on the door, she didn't move. She simply looked up, eyes soft but alert. I nodded. No words were necessary. The night, the apartment, the small, quiet gestures, it was all a beginning, unannounced but real. For the first time in a long while, I sensed that she wasn't just surviving. She was noticing the possibility of being safe, and that, in itself, was remarkable. Some mornings, I wake up feeling the quiet weight of things left unsaid. Today was one of those mornings. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, listening to the faint hum of the apartment, waiting for the soft footsteps that had become a small rhythm. Allison appeared in the doorway, hair still damp from a quick shower, eyes shadowed with the residue of yesterday's exhaustion. She gave me a small nod, a greeting that was more gesture than words, and I smiled. I didn't need more. We moved around each other in the kitchen, the silence punctuated only by the clink of spoons and the hum of the kettle. I noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured her tea, how her shoulders lifted and dropped with unconscious tension. I wanted to say something, to tell her she didn't need to carry the weight alone, but I held my tongue. Presence often spoke louder than advice. Finally, she settled at the table, and I took the seat across from her. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across her face. I watched the way her eyes moved, searching, cautious, curious. She wasn't ready to tell me everything, and that was fine. I didn't ask. I simply let her exist, letting the space between us be generous. I don't know if I can stay long, she said quietly, swirling her tea. I feel like I'm always running from something, from people, from places, from myself. I nodded slowly. You don't have to stay because you have to. You can stay because it's safe, because you want to. And if you leave, that's okay too. Her gaze lifted, sharp for a brief moment, as though testing my sincerity. You really mean that? She asked, a little breathless, the vulnerability tipping into fear. I do, I said simply. No conditions, no expectations, just presence. The words seemed to land. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the tension ebbing. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and gave me the faintest smile. Not gratitude exactly, not relief, but something that hovered in between. Trust, perhaps, in its earliest form. We didn't speak for a while after that. Instead, I watched her as she traced the rim of her mug with a finger, thinking, feeling, being. I could sense the layers she carried, her doubts, her past decisions, the small betrayals life had handed her, and I kept silent, letting them exist without comment. By the time she stood to leave for work, I realized something subtle but important. This wasn't about rescuing her. It wasn't about fixing any. It was about being present, offering steadiness without intrusion, giving her the room to choose. And the smallest choices often mattered more than grand gestures. As she walked out, I felt the apartment expand in her absence, hollow yet expectant, as if it had learned to breathe differently with her presence. I poured another cup of coffee for myself and leaned against the counter, thinking about how connection began, not in words, but in patience, in the quiet permission to exist without fear. And somewhere, in the slow rhythm of a morning spent together without pressing, without demanding, I realized that this simple, unspoken care, was the foundation of something that could grow. The next afternoon, I suggested a coffee at a small shop down the street. I didn't frame it as an invitation, not really. I simply mentioned that the cafe had the quietest corner and the best light for reading, and she accepted with a small nod. She wore a sweater too large for her frame, sleeves pulled over her hands, and I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers as she held her cup. We sat side by side, not across, so that the conversation could flow gently, not confrontational, not demanding. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, watching the steam curl in the air. I watched her too, without pressing for details, just listening to the rhythm of her breathing and the soft murmur of the shop around us. "I've never felt like anyone really chose me," she said suddenly, eyes on the window. "People take, people leave, people assume. I'm tired of being assumed." I nodded, letting the quiet settle around her words. "Then maybe it's time someone listens and waits, instead of assuming," I said softly. She turned to look at me then, and for a moment I thought she might laugh, or cry, or turn back to her cup, but she didn't. She just held my gaze for a beat too long, as if testing the truth of my words. The conversation drifted after that, like two leaves floating on a slow stream. She talked about mundane things, books she wanted to read, streets she liked walking, the way light fell on the city in early morning, but beneath the surface I sensed the undercurrent of her fears, the small hesitations shaped by years of uncertainty. I didn't try to fix her life, didn't suggest solutions, didn't offer advice she hadn't asked for. I just existed beside her, letting presence speak. At one point, a child ran past our table, laughing, and she smiled without thinking, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. I realized then that she was beginning to allow herself to feel normal moments again, small joys without the shadow of past doubts. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it mattered. When the afternoon waned, I offered to walk her home. She hesitated, glanced down at her shoes, then nodded. We moved together through the streets, not touching, not needing to, just occupying the same space with mutual awareness. Each step felt deliberate, a slow negotiation of trust, of quiet willingness to accept company. On the porch of her temporary apartment, she paused. "Thank you," she said softly, eyes lingering on mine, "for this, for not asking too much. You never have to answer more than you're ready for," I said, letting my words hang in the air. She smiled faintly and stepped inside, closing the door with a quiet click. I stayed on the sidewalk a moment longer, feeling the subtle shift in our dynamic. Not romance yet, not even friendship fully, but a new understanding, fragile and honest. And I knew that the simple act of presence, of waiting without pressure, had begun to carve space for something neither of us had dared to name. The evening settled over the apartment like a slow exhale. Allison was on the couch, knees tucked under her chin, a soft blanket draped over her legs. The light from the single lamp created long shadows across the room, and I watched her, careful not to intrude, careful only to observe the rhythm of her small, quiet movements. She had begun to share pieces of herself, fragments at first, almost accidental, slipping out between sips of tea or in moments of hesitation. The more she spoke, the more I realized how much she had carried alone. Her mother's expectations, relentless and sharp, a past relationship that left her doubting her own worth, a string of temporary jobs that offered survival but no comfort. Each detail was a small fracture in a life she had tried to keep whole. I didn't comment. I didn't offer advice or consolation. I merely nodded, letting my presence be a kind of silent acknowledgement. It was enough, sometimes, to just witness someone's story without trying to fix it. "You make it sound so easy," she said suddenly, voice low, almost ashamed. "Just being here, listening. It's like you're not afraid I'll break or run." I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "It's not easy," I said. "It's just necessary, to see and to let be, to offer space without judgment." She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes wide and tentative. There was a moment of something unspoken, trust, maybe, or the cautious testing of safety. I didn't rush it, didn't fill the space with words. I simply let the silence stretch long enough for her to know she could. Later, she laughed at something small, the sound trembling and delicate. I realized it had been months since she had allowed herself laughter, unguarded and soft. It was a tiny rebellion against the weight she carried, a subtle crack in the armor she had built around herself. And I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction, not triumph, not possession, just the deep awareness that sometimes the smallest openings mattered most. We made tea again, sitting with our mugs in hands that barely touched, the ritual becoming something more than necessity, a shared cadence, a quiet acknowledgement. I could feel her walls loosening, imperceptibly but undeniably. I offered her no promises, no expectations, only a steady presence, The night grew heavier, shadows pooling in the corners of. Allison shifted on the couch, drawing the blanket closer, and for a fleeting moment, I sensed the depth of the rarity of feeling chosen without conditions. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it hummed between us like an unspoken pact. Safety, care, and the permission to simply exist. Before leaving for the night, she lingered by the doorway, hesitant. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "Then let it be what it needs to be," I replied. "For now, that's enough." She smiled faintly, a tentative acknowledgement, and I watched her retreat down the hallway, knowing that something had shifted. The apartment was quieter for her absence, but the weight in the room felt different, lighter, as if the walls themselves understood that the beginning of trust had been laid gently, without fanfare. The afternoon arrived heavy with rain, drumming softly against the windows of the apartment. I was tidying up when Allison appeared in the doorway, coat damp, hair clinging to her face. There was a hesitation in her step, a subtle tension that told me she hadn't planned to linger, yet here she was. I don't have anywhere to go tonight," she admitted, her voice barely above the patter of rain. It wasn't a complaint, more a simple acknowledgement of circumstance, and I understood it immediately. Without thinking too much, I gestured toward the living room. "Then you can stay here. It's just tonight, nothing more." Her eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and relief passing across her features. She hesitated at the threshold, as if the idea of safety was unfamiliar, almost foreign. I didn't press, didn't urge. I simply held the space, letting her decide. "I don't want to impose," she said softly, almost apologetically. "You won't," I replied calmly. "This is just a roof, a couch, some warmth, no impositions." The way she moved inside, slow and deliberate, felt like she was testing every corner of the apartment for safety. She didn't unpack her life, didn't make demands. She simply claimed the small area of the couch with a careful reverence. A temporary anchor in a world that had often felt unstable. I watched from the kitchen, not intrusive, only present, making a cup of tea for each of us. Later, we sat on the couch, mugs warming our hands, the rain a steady rhythm against the window. Conversation was minimal, punctuated by the occasional sigh or quiet observation. She spoke in fragments about the day, a coworker's careless remark, a minor failure at the office, the creeping anxiety she carried like a second skin. I listened, letting her words drift into the acknowledging without offering fixes. At one point, she glanced at me, eyes hesitant, almost seeking confirmation. "You really don't mind?" she asked. "I don't," I said, soft but certain. "You're not a burden, you're just here, and that's enough." She smiled faintly, a small gesture of acceptance, and leaned back into the cushions. I realized that offering a space for someone to be without expectation could be more powerful than any speech or gesture. It required patience, consistency, and quiet commitment. We stayed there through the evening, side by side, sharing the warmth of tea, silence, and the occasional gentle word. No promises, no demands, just presence. And as the rain softened to a drizzle, I noticed her shoulders relaxing, her breath deepening, the walls she carried quietly dissolving. By nightfall, she had moved past the initial tension, a subtle acknowledgement of trust settling in her posture. She wasn't speaking, but the ease in her body said enough. She had chosen, for now, to stay. And that, I thought, is how beginnings often start. Small, almost invisible, yet irrevocably real. The apartment smelled faintly of tea and rain, a quiet combination that seemed to settle the air around us. Allison sat curled on the couch, blanket drawn around her, and for a while we said nothing. Silence, in this context, was not absence, but presence. It was a way of being together without pressing, without needing to fill the space with words that might carry too much weight. I poured another cup of tea for her, holding the mug out, and she accepted it with a small nod. The steam rose between us, fragile and warming, and I noticed the way her hands lingered around the cup, seeking comfort in the familiar motion. She didn't speak immediately. She rarely did unless she felt safe enough to let her thoughts spill, and I didn't rush that safety. "I'm not used to this," she said finally, voice soft, hesitant. "Just being here, not being judged, not being asked to prove myself." "You don't need to prove anything," I said quietly. "Not to me, not to anyone. Just be." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of something like relief pass across her face. It wasn't gratitude exactly, it was recognition, the subtle understanding that someone could care without taking, without expecting, without measuring. We lingered in the quiet, letting the apartment itself take on the weight of our presence. Every so often, she would speak, about books she had read, streets she liked walking, small memories of ordinary days, and I listened, absorbing without interruption, acknowledging without imposing. I noticed how her shoulders eased slightly when she laughed at a memory, how her eyes softened when she spoke of something she loved, Hours passed unnoticed. The world outside continued its rhythm of traffic and distant voices, but inside, time felt suspended. We were not lovers, not friends in full, but something had begun. A recognition that companionship could exist without urgency or demand. When the evening light softened into muted shadows, I realized that the smallest gesture, the offer of a mug, the steady presence across the couch, the simple permission to exist, had begun to reshape the contours of our connection. It was a quiet revolution, subtle, imperceptible to anyone outside, but undeniable to us. At one point, she shifted, moving closer just slightly, and I did not move away. There was no sudden intimacy, no dramatic gesture, just a measured acknowledgement that we were learning, together, what it meant to trust without expectation. Eventually, she leaned back, eyes half closed, the blanket drawn snugly around her. "I think I could stay here," she whispered. "You already are," I replied, and for that night, it was enough. Enough that a home, a presence, a quiet warmth existed for her in the simplest of ways, without ceremony, without declaration, just with the steadfast insistence that someone would be there. It was late morning when Allison appeared at my door, a tentative knock that seemed louder than it should have been, carried by the uncertainty of her decision. I opened it slowly, meeting her eyes, noticing the small tremor in her hands as she clutched a folded piece of paper. "A job offer," I later read, "from another city. I don't know what to do," she admitted, stepping inside as though the apartment itself might offer some She placed the paper on the table, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional bird outside the window. I didn't reach for the paper, didn't try to persuade or sway. I simply observed, the steady calm of my presence offering space rather than pressure. "You don't have to decide anything," I said softly. "Sit, breathe, look around, decide when." She sank into the couch, legs drawn beneath her, eyes flicking toward the window as if the world outside held the answer. I poured us both tea, the familiar warmth a quiet ritual, and handed her a cup without words. She accepted it with a faint smile, a gesture small but significant. After a while, she spoke again, voice low and hesitant. I could go. I could take the job, start over somewhere else, but it feels like I'm leaving something important behind, something I didn't even know I could have." I nodded, letting her words settle. "Then perhaps you stay," I said simply. "Not because you have to, not because it's easy, because you want to, because it feels right." Her gaze met mine, searching for certainty, for some unspoken promise. I offered none, only my calm presence and the weight of my sincerity. "You don't owe me a reason, you just decide." And then, in a moment that was quiet but irrevocable, she nodded, the tension in her shoulders eased, her hands unclenching around the cup. "I'll stay," she whispered, almost afraid to speak it aloud. We spent the afternoon in silence, letting the decision linger in the air, neither celebrating nor dramatizing. It wasn't a triumphant moment. It was subtle, understated, but the gravity of it was clear. Something had shifted. She had chosen, and in that choice, she had allowed herself to be seen, to be present, to be safe. Later, we moved through the apartment together, carrying small tasks, watering a plant, arranging the few items she had brought, adjusting a blanket on the couch. Each movement was quiet, deliberate, a shared choreography that spoke more than words could. I noticed the small gestures, the way she lingered near the window to watch the light shift, the careful placement of her cup beside mine, the faint smile she offered when she discovered a forgotten book on the shelf. By evening, she sat back on the couch, shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, truly at ease. I joined her, tea in hand, and we shared the quiet comfort of simply being together. Nothing grand, nothing declared, just the understanding that a home could be more than walls and furniture. It could be a presence, a choice, a subtle but profound permission to belong. The apartment had started to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a shared space, a subtle transformation that happened in ways neither of us fully acknowledged. Every morning, Allison moved through it with quiet purpose, placing her cup on the counter in the same spot, tucking a blanket over the arm of the couch, adjusting a pillow that had slipped just slightly. I watched, noticing how small decisions began to weave us together without fanfare. We didn't talk about what we were building. There was no declaration, no statement of intent. It was in the way she lingered in the kitchen while I made coffee, in the gentle shift of our movements so that we never collided, the small unspoken agreement that this apartment had grown to hold both of us. Even the cat she had taken a tentative liking to, now stretched in the sun without fear, as if sensing the rhythm of safety we had established. One afternoon, she found a plant that had been wilting in the corner and carefully repotted it. She smiled at it, and I could see that small victories mattered to her now, just as much as the big ones had once intimidated her. "It's nice," she said softly. "Feels like we're slowly building something. Yes, I said, one small piece at a time. It was true. Every little gesture, every shared meal, every quiet moment of attention added weight to the subtle gravity of our connection. There were no dramatic declarations, no sweeping gestures of romance, yet I felt the contours of our relationship deepen with every passing day. The apartment itself seemed to hold memory, the faint scent of tea, the soft folds of the blanket she favored, the books arranged with care on the shelves. We had started leaving small notes for each other, not reminders, not demands, just tiny acknowledgments. I made tea or the rain stopped. Nothing elaborate, nothing public, just ways of marking presence. Small tokens of mutual recognition that mattered more than words could capture. I realized I had begun to notice details I would have overlooked before. The way she laughed quietly to herself while reading, how she tilted her head when thinking, the way she paused at the window to watch the light shift across the room. Each observation, subtle and careful, was a quiet testament to my growing care, to the way she had allowed herself to belong here without needing to claim everything. Evenings became our shared time. We moved through it like a practiced rhythm, not needing to speak. The comfort in simple gestures like handing over a mug, sharing the same blanket, or pausing together in the same quiet space. It was the kind of intimacy that required patience, presence, and a willingness to let connection grow without forcing it. By the time night fell, I understood something profound. This was no longer just my home or hers. It was ours. Not because we said it, not because we labeled it, but because our choices, small and deliberate, had created a shared world, a home in progress, fragile, quiet, and entirely ours. The day ended quietly, the kind of evening that holds the soft hum of comfort and the faint scent of rain lingering on the streets outside. Allison sat on the floor among half-unpacked boxes, her back against the couch, a small smile curving her lips as she examined the few belongings she had brought into the apartment. I watched her, noticing how carefully she placed each item, the way she seemed to measure her presence, making the space hers without erasing mine. "I think I've found a home," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice held no certainty, only the tentative wonder of someone realizing that belonging might be possible. I knelt beside her, letting my hands rest casually on the floor, not touching hers but close enough to share the quiet moment. "I knew you would recognize," I said, careful not to make it sound like a boast, just an observation born of patient knowing. She looked up then, eyes wide and bright, the faintest tremor in her chest betraying how much she had longed to hear something, even from herself. There was no need for grand declarations, no words of passion or promises she wasn't ready for. What mattered was the acknowledgement of choice, the gentle assurance that she had been seen and accepted in her entirety, fragile edges and all. We spent the rest of the evening arranging things together, her books on the shelf, a few framed photos in the corner, the way the light fell on the rug. There was a rhythm to it, unspoken but mutual, a quiet choreography of two people who had begun to trust each other without needing to define it yet. The apartment, once just walls and furniture, had transformed into a shared space, layered with small gestures that mattered more than words ever could. At some point, she leaned back against the couch, hands clasped loosely in her lap, and looked around the room. "It feels ours," she murmured, a tentative acknowledgement of something larger than herself. "Yes," I said softly, "it does." There was no urgency to define what ours meant. It was in the shared silence, the soft clinks of mugs on the counter, the faint laughter at small, mundane discovery, the mutual patience that carried us here. Something significant, though it was subtle, quiet, and entirely unforced. Later, we sat side by side on the floor, leaning back against the couch, letting the apartment cradle us. Outside, the city hummed its distant lullaby, and inside, the quiet presence of each other sufficed. There were no promises of tomorrow, only the steady reality of today, someone to share space with, someone who chose to remain, someone who saw without judgment. When the lights dimmed and the boxes remained half unpacked, I realized that the home she had been searching for had never been only about walls or keys. It had been about presence, about the choice to stay, about the permission to exist safely in someone's steady gaze. And in that, the smallest of gestures had carried the largest weight. The answer was already here, quietly, between us.